Thank you. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thanks for inviting me, and I will do my best to talk about what we have foreseen as addressing identity challenges over the course of the last couple of years at Oracle, and as well as in the industry that we see out there that's looking at the open source world as well. I'll be touching on some of those concepts towards the end of the discussion. So a little bit about my background. I actually have joined Oracle about 2 years ago, and I've been working in identity and access management ever since. The application security space is very interesting, and I'm also a current member of the OWASP chapter in Singapore. So all those part of the OWASP chapter and here, you know, just hi, hello. So back to today's presentation. Essentially, one of the reasons why I started with this slide was just to show that, well, obviously Einstein is not here presenting from university and where he is in the institute. But the key thing to note is that it really is myself. I'm at Pal Singh Dhillon, Senior Advisor for Identity Management Security. So what uniquely differentiates me from another person, perhaps, that you would have seen in the slide? Well, some things that we have to note, for example, would include your context in how you are actually talking about something pertaining to a conference. Here we are discussing about addressing identity challenges. We also talk about the unique time that this is occurring to identify that that conference is actually occurring today. That's matched with the location, in fact, where we are, and we could have been in another place as well. Some of the other things that are more apparent would be like your visual aids and identifying me in respect to Einstein in this case. Also, there's an identifier that uniquely mentions a name difference, and we all know that can be different as well and difficult to manage. There's also a particular role, as I will touch later in this conference, on how roles could potentially manage organizational changes and perhaps even help us in managing fraud. One of the other key areas is the historical precedence on what a person really was and what he is today, so how the behavior changes. Finally, the last piece, really the entitlements and what a person is and what he's allowed to do. So these are some of the unique characteristics or attributes in whatever way you want to look at it, from the directory standpoint, from the visual standpoint, that uniquely identify a person. The last piece right there, an unfederated, meaning, well, if you had secure exchange of information between different conferences or different institutions, how would you have federation capabilities with that? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So in summary, this sort of gives you an idea that there's a lot of unique characteristics or attributes that single out a particular individual, and there's a lot more we can do to identify between what is a person and what is another representation of the same person. A lot of people talk about digital personas, and there are a whole lot of different words that you would see in the identity and access management landscape. So we have been seeing that obviously, in today's world, that business is risky, and a lot of losses in terms of people losing money because of fraudsters getting inappropriate access privileges and so forth. But we also have to understand that there's a lot at stake for the processes that needs to be better in place for changing times and so forth. So we need more of a risk-aware approach, and that's going to be the theme of my presentation today, essentially. Citigroup and Mellon Bank were just some of the ones that were victims of such fraudulent use, for example. So what are some of the challenges that are facing enterprises today? We see a whole lot of needs for strong authentication. There are needs for how HR data is entered, and that's different from before you start in the company and after you leave, for example. Falsification of information, as well as insider fraud and so forth. think I was just reading one of the biggest challenges for organizations these days is that people who are leaving for competitors tend to download a lot of information before they're leaving, architecture drawings, diagrams, and so forth, so that, in the event that they go somewhere else, you're going to be impressing the new manager, right? I know all this stuff about what I'm doing and so forth. So a lot of these things are, I wouldn't say common sense, but they are bound to happen. So we need the systems in place to be able to manage a lot of these insider fraud type of activities. And also from the financial angle that we see, there's a lot in terms of account takeover, wire fraud, phone tapping, and so forth. So even to the extent that the other day I was talking to a company in the utility space, there's even things like meter fraud and how meters are looked at on a daily basis. So it's just not ending on one particular space. As long as you have internet access and you're exposing a function for another person to use, and this proliferation of challenges will definitely come. So more recently, we have seen securities, commodities as well. Definitely, there is a need to have more of a proactive approach, a risk-aware approach, rather than a detect and repair and fix type of approach. So we have seen that a lot of legal implications for some of these challenges coming across, but they're not strong enough. We need something that can withstand the changes and be able to better evolve with these changing regulations as well. So just in the context of what's going on in the world, we realize that there's a lot of write-downs and what's occurring with banks. There's a magnitude of impact. There's a lot of losses. So you're going to ask me, what has this got to do with security and HITB? Well, it's a failure of risk management and a governance function to some extent. It's a failure of companies in a point of view to realize that risk is an important function that needs to be dealt with from a security standpoint as well. I would imagine that you could potentially tie a user to a particular transaction and be able to assign a particular reputation in the future and say that this transaction might not be good enough if it amounts to another 100 people doing the same thing. It could potentially cause an economic wreck, for example. So there are potentials, and there is a lot of areas that identity and access management could impact business, so to speak. I'm not saying that we are talking about credit risk or market risk and so forth, but risk per se has not been defined that well in a lot of institutions. And perhaps security could be a better way for a lot of these folks to understand how it could make an impact for them. So now going into more a bit about the identity challenges that we see in today's world. Well, really in the real world, you see more of like a sense-based type of interaction between human beings and so forth. There's proximities and so forth, and there's titles and privileges. So, as an analogy, or, what we see in the digital world is it's more authentication-centric if you look in terms of what a sense-based interaction is. Proximity, we actually look in terms of remote connectivity, whether you're coming in and, dialing in to the internet and access. And relationships we manage through what we call federation, and the premise of trust and relying parties and so forth. Titles and privileges, well, this is an interesting topic. We will discuss in terms of roles and permissions, and how we can mimic relationships within a particular hierarchy or like a reporting structure and so forth. So there's a key difference between what the real world and digital world, but we're trying to, best represent a lot of these relationships. So the types of threats and consequences are obviously growing, and we realize that there's a lot of phishing, farming, man in the middle, man in the browser type attacks, and so forth, insider fraud and whatnot. So a lot of these have been from compromised credentials that have been on particular laptop, for example, or in transition, or most obvious, a person sitting in the browser as well. Session hijacking, transaction hijacking, and so forth. So we see a lot of intents from people moving from a criminal type intent to more of fame and fortune kind of requirements and so forth for particular people. So it is a hacking conference, so you might be able to relate to some of these objectives. So what do we see in the challenges in fraud management today? We see that today it's still authentication based. We're still looking at it in terms of what is more like a Boolean type. It's 1 or 0. It's either you're in or you're out. So we also see that there have been proliferation of authorization, basic authorization for applications. They handle their basic roles, their policies that restrict a bunch of users or groups and so forth for access. So the problems are that this can be easily compromised. It's not a business aware or reactive to changes in policies. And also there is needs for forensic analysis or intelligence that needs to be done in the back end. For example, I might want to do some mining of data of your authorization capabilities and how it would change in the future and project that. Do things like what if analysis, or what is, for example, your reporting structure 6 months ago. You would start thinking about things that is like more temporal in nature. So how do you use a lot of these capabilities to move forward in the fraud management world? We see the challenges in these paradigms on computer network as well as the social scale. So the end user challenges become that fraud cannot be controlled and the confidence in the channel is affected. There is lack of ease of use, and people typically have a lot of different tokens when having to log in. Is that the solution? I'm not sure it is. I think it is a step towards the right direction, possibly, but there is definitely a need to adopt more of a risk-based approach. And as the presentation goes on, you will understand more about what I'm talking about, this risk-based methodology and so forth. It's not something completely new. A lot of organizations and banks understand it, well, up until now, if you think about what just happened in the world. So, of course, it has to be cost-effective, and it has to have a strong value proposition for certain industries and so forth. So the enterprise challenges, we see a lot of this complex needs for point-to-point integrations between applications and the fact that it's non-compliant. The business becomes unfriendly, and today's time and age, everyone needs to be able to come in and make a transaction quickly, securely, and more importantly, get 360 view of his capabilities, likewise the enterprise of your services, so that they can give you more value-added services. So going back to what we just discussed on some of the challenges, you kind of begin to understand that context is important. The time of a particular event, transaction, authentication, authorization is important. The location of where it's being done, whether it's geolocation, whether it is being done between different areas in a short period of time, your entitlements, what you really represent, what your title is, that has to be able to be manageable as well. That has to relate to if you move to a different application, you might have different entitlements. How do you manage it in a single sort of manageable way? Your historical behavior as well as your unique identifiers are crucial in this. So we'll touch a little bit into each of these areas right now, focusing a little bit more on the fraud aspect over here. So how do you, for example, use your unique identifier, your name, to be able to create and store or virtualize identities? So we know that in the past, we have always looked at what tools are what called like meta tools. It's synchronizing identities, pulling it all in one place so you can help to manage it better. Well, we want to be able to use identities as they are in the landscape, in the mixed environment, in the messy environment it is, so that you can rapidly deploy applications, for example. And this should go for whether or not you are accessing any type of application, but you could be looking up users, whether they are stored in a directory, in a database, mainframe, for example, or even in web services and so forth. The interesting thing about virtual directory is that there is no actual pulling of or syncing of information down to one particular yet another directory, for example. It's pretty much a lookup in terms of it provides you a gateway to access a lot of your identities. So, for example, part of you might be stored in a directory, and yet another part of you might be in a database. So, what I would, as an application, a new business application, I would want a unified representation of yourself, so that I could quickly develop the application, and turnaround time will be really important for example, a CIO, and yet you are able to manage your different identities from a single console. So that's one area that we have seen in the change between what is meta and virtual world. A lot of key areas in this that we have seen, for example, in industries like telecommunications, where there's a need for having a unified user profile of an individual, and yet the person is spread over the entire organization. So how do you do that in a virtual way? So that's one way. So the identity management challenges still remain in that we need to start looking at, for example, a person's particular role, and how do we provision these roles and identities? How do we manage these identities in a system that would allow you to be able to have touch points to your whole IT infrastructure? So with that, there are needs for secure provisioning, and that a user's life cycle has to be managed from the day he actually comes on board till the day he leaves. And how do you manage the email, forecasts, channels, and so forth? So there's somewhat of a automation required in this administration, so to speak. However, we believe that managing and provisioning identities and basic roles is not sufficient to represent the requirements of the businesses today. And there is an evolution needed from moving from identities to relationships. So in the beginning, as you had seen in the previous slides, was that there was manual provisioning. You had a whole bunch of users, and there was cost and boss, and really who makes the rules was just some little cat in the middle. And finally, you have access to your applications. So we see that there is a complex approval chain. Most often than not, there is not complex, and you just have one person. So obviously, that can be disastrous. So the process was hard to control and audit. Obviously, a lot of people found difficulties in this. There was a response in the industry, and he talked a lot about SOX and what that was and whatnot. So there was a need that we added provisioning tools. And with this, you had like self-service administration. Some of the companies you might see have this capability for you to be able to change your profile and be able to help with automation and audit of information. So what is not enough with this? Well, they're not business smart. They're not business aware. In the real world, there's a polyarchy, where a simple definition of that really is it's an intersection of hierarchies. Hierarchies really is basically your representation of yourself in your org. Sometimes you go into an enterprise and you click on a particular link, and you can see how you report and how far you're away from your boss, and where you would like to go and so forth. Believe it or not, that's usually the most visited website in an enterprise. So what's interesting is your different orgs, and finance, corporate, whatnot, and you are essentially part of something else. And so on top of that, you will have clerks, Jane, people, and so forth, representing or being part of members of these org and so forth. So they actually report into different people. So you have managers, directors, and so forth. So which then has a complex matrix on how one org, is represented as part of another. You start losing your way a little bit in being able to represent this. To some extent, some of these relationships have been maintained in databases as well as directories, but it's been a challenge. So then what happens when there's job sharing of roles? Constant turnover, for example. And you could be ahead of a particular org and be ahead of another org at the same time. So finance is just another area and so forth. So what we are concerned about here, it really is about shared services and outsourcing, and how about restructuring and so forth. So a lot of business impacts would put a lot of pressure on this polyarchy in the real world and to be able to represent it in the digital world. So the evolution of identity management comes to having to be able to manage roles better. And to be able to manage roles better in terms of whilst you're doing provisioning. So essentially, you will not only be able to define who has access to what, but you will be able to have an abstraction, so to speak. Because you have thought about today managing people and then managing attributes, and now a significantly higher level of representation on roles, which is in a business context easier to manage as well as within IT as well. So enterprise role management will have users, relationships, roles, and policies that which you could tap into from people data, from your governance solutions, web services, portals, and so forth. So really, it's all about relationships and how one person in a particular org is related to another, and how can we reuse roles. So you start thinking about what is essentially role mining and capabilities of this sort. In a polyarchy engine, you might want to have, like, for example, a particular finance team grouped by a geographical business unit. And how would you achieve that if you had siloed representation of roles throughout your landscape or your organization? So a particular person like John might be really heading a lot of different departments as well. And this might quickly change. So there is definitely a need to be able to manage these intersecting relationships. So having simplified this role management using a context or an abstraction, as I mentioned, you will be able to do mining across a user base, and you will be able to have more clarity and transparency in organization, and centrally manage roles. Because if you really manage a person's role appropriately, and his access changes, or his access is given according to what role he has, then you're really effectively managing access, so to speak, as well. So a lot of the benefits is that you will be able to achieve what is known as role-based access control, some of the standards developed by NIST and so forth, but this is taking it to one level further. Not just users, identities, they are basic 2 or 3 tier approach, but looking at more complex approvals and provisioning and so forth. So some of the capabilities is that you will be able to flag anomalies and risky behavior and so forth. Key thing is basically about roles is that you will be able to link business roles to what your organization understands to system privileges, because there's always a disconnect between what a person is doing and what that person's role is from the day he entered in HR. So we talked a little bit about managing provisioning, a little bit about role management and so forth. We'll look at what is more relevant to application security, so to speak, where there is a need to uniquely identify and secure access. So here, as we all know, that there's a dark side of the internet, and social engineering, phishing, bots, and there's man in the middle and whatnot. So there's a need for a risk-aware continuous authentication. Continuous meaning that it should not stop and just say, look, you are either allowed or not allowed, and that's about it. And maybe I'll just do a few more authorization checks at the application level, and then you're good to go. Well, we see the threats is ongoing, and they're obviously changing and evolving. And we see that the data that resides within devices, which could be defined as different browsers, locations, network forensics, your context, your third party, as well as your analytics, is all part of what is data that is passing through the network and so forth. So we see there's a need for having proper security and business policies and workflows to manage a lot of these threats as well as data. And with that, you will be able to assign particular risk scores and alerts So it's like you will be able to make a decision by assessing the outcome. It really goes back to, it's really an economic definition in that, you know, the best way to come up with the decision is to analyze the outcome and so forth. So not the best way, but it's a way. So with that, you'll be able to use a lot of these outcomes and the inputs of this back into where you foresee certain threats to be emerging. So it becomes a continuous risk-aware methodology. So what happens is really in a public, this is just an example of a particular session. Mostly we have seen solutions out there in a mass scale managing, you know, cookies and part of a session or part, you know, points of a session. So when you're in a public area, really you have some mitigation approaches. You have, you know, basic public or internet sites and so forth. And confidence level as well, not really that high. So as you go deeper into the session, you see that the acceptable confidence level increases, and there's a need for username, passwords, and a little bit stronger authentication. And here you might have discussions, self-forms, and so forth. So now that you know who you are, you need to know what you can do and so forth, and you need to start looking at the transactions. You need to be able to have role-based access as well as fine-grained entitlement management about what you can do and, you know, where you can click, what you can see, and whatnot. Finally, you need to be able to achieve a trusted sort of level where you will have capabilities to manage high-level or high-value transactions and appropriately adjust or step up your authentication levels for those type of transactions and use a risk-based methodology for that. So here is where we will start to look at the capabilities to handle behavior and unique or multiple profiles of a person throughout the session. So when we start looking at that, it's about protecting against identity fraud. And we see that there's a lot of secure ways that people can actually come in. There has been talk about two-factor authentications, soft tokens, and so forth. And I understand the hesitancy from a lot of people on why soft tokens, and, you know, there is a lot of ways that that can be circumvented as well, and so forth. How many people have actually read about the Bank of America case study here? Okay, so none. So in that sense, there's a lot of news out there and how people, actually hackers, put together really nice breakdowns of an organization, and it really does helps an organization to grow and be able to deal with their own security requirements a lot. So we see a lot of cross-channel transaction behavior, anomaly detection capabilities as well. So what we see is that, you know, in next generation security and fraud prevention, you will have your applications, you will have your you know, different types of e-commerce types of silos and so forth. But what's more important is that you have a risk engine that is really evaluating your session, and you are allowed to apply different types of security or business policies. And you are able to tap into your existing data stores. For example, your anti-money laundering data store. You might want to be able to tap into that and understand the patterns and be able to apply the patterns on the during the transaction for a particular user or particular set of users from a particular country. Finally, the data management aspect as well. So breaking it down into this level, we see that large-scale applications, there is a lot of increasing requirements for this scoring and identity proofing and so forth. Pattern and anomaly detection is really interesting in that I'm able to today, for example, log into an application, and tomorrow if I use, you know, if I suddenly change into what is called fat fingering, or I use a different type of typing method, how is that tracked and managed against my profile yesterday? And how is fuzzy logic used in terms of that? There are solutions out there that even look at neural networks, tapping into your data mining capabilities of databases as well. So that should be the way. We should be moving towards an adaptive, proactive approach using the metrics and heuristics that are available in the data tier and use it during the authentication session and so forth. Because it's there and it's sitting there, and we really, quite frankly, have not used it as much as we possibly could. So looking at it like how the solutions should be really agnostic to channels, whether or not you're coming in from the web, from the ATM, call center, or even from a mobile network, it really should be able to go through some kind of data transformation layer and have a risk engine, so to speak. So what you're looking at the heart of it really is ARM. It's an adaptive risk manager that is able to do, tap into a lot of data providers and do linkages between your profiles and how they are changed and deny you access appropriately. So that's really interesting and fascinating stuff in that we are seeing a convergence of a lot of solutions out there and being able to use it while figuring out who you are and what you can really do. So really what this is talking about an aspect where we would like to work with partners and partner alliance, because we realize that there's no one silver bullet to the security landscape, and there are a lot of solutions out there that do a lot of different things. For example, you might have adaptive fraud authentication, but you might want to be able to say that, look, you still need to prevent man-in-the-middle or man-in-the-browser type attacks. To a certain extent, it can be done, and you can apply a lot of rules during pre-authentication, in session, as I talked about, post-authentication as well. But some people still might want to be able to have certificates and so forth. So how do you work with the different customer requirements and tokens as well as biometrics as part of this channel or securing the session? And we see that there's a lot of good, interesting integrations going on in that space. So looking at so far access, we've talked about a little bit of provisioning. Now we want to look at a little bit about entitlements. In a specific application, we understand that in the real world there is distributed policy enforcement points. And ideally you would like to have dedicated enforcement points, dedicated administration and decision points as well. But in the real world, well, they're distributed. So we have to live with that. So how do we manage the read, write, visible, clickable capabilities of a particular application? And how do we assign particular users to these grants, or grant users to these particular privileges? So this is, there is a requirement, and a lot of applications were not designed to be able to handle security in such ways. But what happened is that these applications are being used for a lot of important transactions. So within the application, there's a need to be able to do entitlement management. And so this is what we call fine-grained authorization. And so with this, you'll be able to do decisioneering to the level of if a particular person has a grant of a read, he will be able to manage, he will have specific constraints according to time, people, location as well, and his specific action as well. So we are moving ahead of what was just traditionally web single sign-on, now really fine-grained as well. So now I talked a little bit about that with identifiers. Lastly, or actually, yeah, not lastly, but federation is always an interesting concept, and it's taken up quite big in the Western world and so forth, and I think it's picking up as well in Asia as well. A lot of the challenges here were in terms of accountability and so forth, and you know, who the relying party is and whatnot. But we see that there is a lot of there is a need to be able to have this sharing of identity information if people don't want to embark on you know, completely from scratch on a new identity and access management landscape. So there's a lot of protocols in SAML 2.0, and a lot has been achieved. In fact, if you go online and look at Liberty Alliance, a lot of vendors working together with a lot of specialists as well. So there's a lot of, there's a great deal of business use in this. It's just a question of better accountability and better identifying who's the trust relying party is and so forth, service providers and identity providers. So then we finally reach what we call Identity Management 2.0. Essentially, you are able to create and store virtualize your identities, provision identities and roles, manage your entitlements, as well as federate them. So with that, we enter a space where you are able to externalize and centralize your security alike. And you have, whether you are going through user self-service, whether it's architects using a system, whether it's auditors or even resources. You might have a whole suite of SOA applications or web service-based, but you might want to tap into a lot of services, such as strong authentication, fine-grained, segregation of duty policies, and so forth. So how do you tap into that? How do you use the identity management 2.0? Is it just another buzzword? Is it a marketing word? How do you use it? What would it make sense for your organization? Well, there is what you call an identity services framework, where you have abilities to tap into particular open standards, like the WS services, SPML, and so forth, and even the legacy applications like mainframes and so forth, where there's a need to want to manage it via the web and so forth, and you're using federated tokens. And how do you tap into these services and consume them? So there's a lot of infrastructure that you can tap into quite easily. So here is a just a little bit deeper in terms of some of the services that are offered by Oracle in platform security services, how you can design, when you're designing an application, when doing administration, audit different functions, how you'll be able to have these applications look at what is declarative API, for example, that you might want to tap into. So you will be able to actually use the policy management tool of the SOA and so forth. So what OWSM really is managing web services and security. Entitlements we have discussed earlier. And also tapping into the virtualized identity stores. So really by delivering identity management 2.0 is through leveraging a lot of these platform security services. And you'll be able to tap into this abstraction of APIs that you might be able to use, so you can separate your security logic from your business applications, so to speak. And so that your runtime is easier to manage. We'll talk a little bit about the benefits. It will obviously accelerate your application development and simplify your application maintenance. If you have one developer and another working, there will be a lot more easier to understand what security is and how to increase the level of authentication or manage it or add a new user, tap into a new repository. Gone will be the days where you need to write new code or new Perl scripts to LDAP, for example, and you have different ways of managing security. So you'll have an optimized way and so forth. So here's one use case, an example where you want to secure a Java application using CSS. You might want to have an end user, and you have all these requirements, single sign-on, authorization, and so forth. So how do you protect the servlets and communication between the servlets and EJBs and so forth using roles? So you'll be able to tap into, for example, over here, the WebLogic service interface. Here you'll have the SSPI, but on top of that you'll have OPSS, for example. Another example, looking just a little bit into the future, where we have ADF, Application Development Framework, as well as Web Center applications using some of the tools. And you will have an application, JSPs, going through particular filters and having to access privileges on that particular page. And you'll be able to tap into a policy store and identify whether that person is entitled to a particular section of the page, or shall he not be able to click a particular link. So that's the power that you'll get in being able to tag onto or tap into a lot of these frameworks like Jazz and so forth, JNDI and whatnot. So really what you have seen is basically a use case where you wanted to identity enable an application. Users come in and they want to be able to go through an API and be able to manage, tap into all those services, and at the same time being able to use the standard protocols, infrastructure, as well as the administration capabilities of these solutions. So you'll have secure application development, and the idea is whatever your application is, you'll be able to tap into the different areas of services. And what we see is a convergence of these shared services and across different layers. For example, product portfolio, identity services, the technology, as well as the persistence, whether it's in a directory, a database, a file, or whatnot. This is just one of the last slides I wanted to touch on. I've been quite involved in the user-centric identity management framework while I was in the States. There is a great deal out there in terms of card space, OpenID, a lot of popularity, and so forth, as well as the Higgins platform and OWASP, you probably know, open authentication and so forth. So there's a lot of the alignment between Oracle's technologies. We see that we have to be able to tap into those and be able to provide a holistic approach to security so that you present the options to end users. There's enterprise-centric, there's user-centric, there's a whole lot of different centric management systems. So a lot of them will gain popularity, begin to gain more popularity. And as we see more and more of them in the enterprise world, we need to be able to have systems that are ready and be able to capture these APIs in the runtime easily, or use the APIs. So a lot of the ongoing efforts we see in line with Burton Group, even Open Liberty in the identity governance framework, and so forth, are critical in measuring and coming up with the appropriate standards of the future of identity and access management is by no means over. There's a lot that needs to be done, and I think it needs a community effort, and a lot of the efforts from the hacker community, and the hacker community, okay, yeah, and more communities that actually challenge the status quo on what identity and access management really is. So with that, I want to leave you with 3 key evolutions that have started, and one is just to be aware that relationships exist in real life, and there's a need to be able to understand and digitally manage these relationships in complex IT environments. RBAC, which was known as role-based access control, has a new meaning in life in terms of risk-based access control, using a risk-aware approach to manage roles as part of an overall risk profile to prevent, stop fraud, or minimize fraud, and a whole lot of next-generation access management capabilities as well. Finally, service-oriented security, where we see a convergence and alignment between SOA, security, and identity. Thank you. I think I still have a couple of minutes, so we can go with questioning, I guess. It's a hacker community. I assume there'll be much more questions than typical presentation.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a question here.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, wouldn't this be a whole lot of things to manage? I pity the person who has to do this.
Right. I share your point, your concern there. I would ask a question on in an industry or in a typical enterprise, there's a lot of things to manage anyways. What we are going towards is a standards-based approach, and being able to come up with a common set of criteria, a common set of API that you will be able to manage your identity that is constantly growing in a landscape. I realize that what we are discussing is different sets of problems in an industry, but usually not every industry has all these problems. What we are covering is essentially a spectrum of what we have seen in whole sets, different sets of users, industry sets, and whatnot in one presentation. So typically when you talk about like a specific set of banks might just have strong authentication concerns. So you look at in terms of more entitlements, and you look in terms of strong authentication, your risk-aware approach. But the key thing is that going forward into the future, you want to be able to have a common set of API, common set of standards that which you don't have to waste a lot of time developing security entangled into your business or logic and so forth. So you want to have a clean separation between that and everything underneath that, in fact, even the infrastructure and so forth. So there is no one solution to all, but if everyone achieves and supports the open community supports that, then you get more of this uptake of this, and it just becomes much easier going forward. Hope that sort of answers your question. Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor?
Right.
No further questions? Well, that's excellent. We'll break for lunch, and if you have any further questions you'd like to direct to Mr. Amitpal directly, he will be at the Oracle booth.
Yeah, actually, so there's just a red booth right there, and we'll be having some demos for some of the different technologies I've talked about. So you might be able to have a better look and feel of it, and might be able to discuss it a little further as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amitpal.
Yeah.